Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Some of you, this is your first visit. Some of you have been here 20 times, but you're equally welcome. Kay actually was unwise to say I'd been lumped with this job, because actually very few people I'd rather introduce. Those of you who have heard Tahirih before will know that she has some very interesting insights. And she's actually talking in a subject which is related to what she spoke of last time she spoke for us, which is what impact COVID has made. Let me tell you something a little about Tahirih's work, because what she does is she advises companies and charity projects to try and maximize the positive socioeconomic impact of any project upon the people in the vicinity of the project. So it's a very worthwhile activity, and it requires a lot of thinking. Luckily, we're going to be the beneficiaries of some of that thinking. Tahirih postulates really is that the impact of COVID, which has been a worldwide problem, which, as you have seen, affects the rich as well as the poor, the mighty as well as the powerless. And what Tahirih is going to look at is the degree to which the collective consciousness of humankind is being affected by such an international cataclysm. Tahirih, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome and the opportunity to be in your presence. As it was mentioned, I've had the pleasure of being here once before and spoke about, again, the issue of COVID, because it's present in all our lives at this point in time. So last time, if you were here, you may remember that we talked about a great deal of details about COVID. This time, we're not going to pay so much attention to bits and pieces of facts and information about COVID, but rather about a long-term process that now we've been in for a number of months, and using that trajectory to look at what may lie ahead. This is so we are able to better navigate through the changes that we are experiencing at this point in time, and to recognize the patterns that are emerging around us in order to ensure that our experiences over the coming months and coming years are going to be to our benefit and to the benefit of those around us. So before I begin, I just wanted to mention, following what Kay said, that just as this event is very special to him because of Zebi's fireside that he attended, this is a very special fireside for me to attend, because Kay's grandparents were actually responsible for my parents rejoining the Baha'i community. They hosted the firesides at which my parents came to know about the Baha'i faith, which had been completely removed from them in Iran. My father actually was from a Baha'i background, but he never knew that he was what the Baha'i faith was or what he belonged to. And it was through Kay's grandparents that he recognized the Baha'i faith, and both my parents decided to join the Baha'i community more than 60 years ago. So I'm very grateful to Kay for reconnecting me as well to this experience, and keeping the organic process of the relationship between our souls and the Baha'i revelation through various generations in our family. So with that in mind, I suppose I can start to screen share now, right? Is this a good time to do it?
Yes, please do.
All right. Is it working now? Let's see. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right. So Just to mention that whatever I'm sharing is very much just sorry, I think I have to do this again, are just my thoughts. They're kind of scattered at the moment because some of you may know that this year we are celebrating or marking the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations. So for a number of days, there were a number of sessions held online, which are part of the usual UN General Assembly meeting. What was significant about this year's gathering, aside from it being the 75th anniversary, was that because the United Nations announced right at the beginning of the COVID outbreak that social distancing for all UN events will be in place until 2024, this year's General Assembly then took place digitally. And because of that, usually the UN General Assembly receives messages and participation by maybe 80 or 90 heads of state and representatives of national governments. This year, it surpassed 170. So in essence, this year, it really was a United Nations. In addition, alongside with the UN General Assembly, those individuals who are part of the space about sustainable development and human rights and are accepted members of a body called the United Nations Global Compact, which looks at the role of the private sector in achieving rights and entitlements of individuals. There were a number of sessions that again took place. Literally thousands of people were part of consultations. It was quite an interesting event to witness. Again, the level of participation was phenomenal because literally every people on Earth was represented. Then just the past few days, there was another annual event that I happened to be a part of, and it's the Athens Democracy Forum that the New York Times and a number of governments puts on in Greece. So as a result of participation in these various spaces, I have come to have a new understanding of where we're going with regard to the concept of collective consciousness and the impact of COVID-19 on development of this collective consciousness. So please excuse me if to be, but it's simply because these momentous events have been taking place and I've been exposed to so much information and I'm trying to rejig my thinking about this phenomenon. Nevertheless, it's a pleasure to share these thoughts with you. I look forward to your feedback, and this is more of a consultation once I'm done with the PowerPoint than anything else. So, as you may have seen from the little invitation that went around, the concept of collective consciousness is one that sociologist Emile Durkheim made famous in 1893. And his definition is very basic. Of course, there are different fields that have explored this notion, different philosophers, different thinkers and scholars. But for Durkheim, who was very much focused and concerned with socioeconomic development of individuals, he had a very simple definition, which we have right now on the screen. He felt that collective consciousness is a shared understanding of social norms, beliefs, and ideas. Fast forward maybe a couple of decades. Of course, at the time that Durkheim was talking about these notions of collective consciousness, the Baha'i faith had just been born and was gaining momentum and popularity around the globe. The image that you see on the screen is the guardian of the Baha'i faith, a young man at the time named Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi described a definition of collective consciousness within the paradigm of Baha'u'llah's revelation. He said, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, whose supreme mission is none other but the achievement of this organic and spiritual unity of the whole body of nations, should, if we be faithful to its implications, be regarded as signalizing through its advent the coming of age of the entire human race. It should be viewed, meaning the revelation of Baha'u'llah or the Baha'i faith, as marking the last and highest stage in the stupendous evolution of man's collective life on this planet. The emergence of a world community, the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization and culture as the furthermost limits in the organization of human society, though man as an individual will, nay, must indeed, as a result of such a consummation, continue indefinitely to progress and develop. So within this weighty paragraph, we see the notion of collective consciousness. We see the primary aim of the Baha'i faith. We see characteristics of the age we're going through, which has to do with the emergence of a world community. We see the interconnectedness and the symbiotic relationship between human civilization, our evolution, as well as the indefinite progress of individuals as global citizens at this point in our history. I now would like to share with you a quotation by a woman who was responsible for the emergence of perhaps the most important development after the formation of the United Nations following World War I and World War II. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of the President of the United States at the time, as you know, was the chair of the committee appointed by the United Nations to come up with the drafting of a global proclamation now known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When she was talking about this universal, this global document, she had a very practical definition of it, which I think is something we've lost over the decades, because our vision of what is global, what is collective, has become a bit airy-fairy. And at the level of theory and what's out there and the globe, it has nothing to do with the reality of our day-to-day lives. And I'd like to share this with you because this really defines what human rights, including socioeconomic rights, which are very practical matters. Socioeconomic rights are about the right to food, right to shelter, right to health, education, and work. So these are things we're all consumed with. These are the things that really define our experience of our collective reality at this point. And Mrs. Roosevelt described them as such. She said, they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in. So you see how quickly she brings it from the level of theory and imagination at the global level to what is right immediately in our surroundings. So the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And she said this in 1948 when the Universal Declaration came into existence. So these are, when you read that last sentence about equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination, it's as though you're talking about, the experiences we're going through today. So let's just, rewind a little bit to see where we've come from over the past 100 years. Because when we talk about a pandemic, many people talk about the Spanish flu, which is wonderful, fantastic, and great, but it really gives us a sort of a century-long trajectory to see where we were and where we are today. Because I like to argue, for lack of a better word, I like to propose that actually the experience we're having with COVID-19 is the first global pandemic that we're going through. Now, COVID happened in 2019, as you know. It really emerged at the end of 2019. And 2019 is the year that we marked the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, which was primarily concerned with a global code for rights of workers. So very much focused, again, on very practical generation of rights, socioeconomic rights. It was after that development that World War I and World War II took place and really took off. And then, it sort of, led to the formation of the United Nations, the emergence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then, of course, we went through the Cold War era, the polarization that took place between the East and the West. After that, of course, we had the changes that really took place right here in the heart of Europe that seemed to end that era of Cold Wars. We then focused on the emergence of the new millennium. With it, the international community was very much focused on setting goals to eliminate poverty and to enable humanity to flourish as one human family. So we came up with Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, that were supposed to help us achieve a certain standard of living for everyone from the year 2000 to 2015. We didn't eliminate poverty, and some of the goals improved, but were not achieved entirely. So then from 2015 to 2030, we're having the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, which are very much, again, about human rights, in particular the right to education, right to work, women's rights, the rights of workers, youth, incredibly important 17 goals that all of us should be extremely familiar with, because COVID has actually accelerated and exaggerated their need at an unprecedented rate. So, as I mentioned earlier, the International Labor Organization has now turned 100 years old. This year, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations. We just had the United Nations Global Compact event, and we've just kicked off the start of the Decade of Action. The Decade of Action is concerned with the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals in order to eliminate poverty throughout the entire planet by the year 2030. So between 2020 and 2030 is when we're supposed to see this happen. So here we are, kicking off our Decade of Action, and what happens? COVID-19. Some of us may know that issues such as human rights or poverty or equality of genders were sort of, being overtaken with economic interests. The emergence of massive multinational corporations, with the rise of technology. We have things like Facebook, we have things like Google, we have things like Amazon, that, the economic preoccupation of the global community sort of overshadowed certain deficits and gaps in our development. COVID-19 has served as an inequality accelerator, in the sense that it has really made it quite obvious to us that there is inequality. Now, there are many inequalities, but 4 of the categories of inequality are grabbing more attention than others. And in my field of work, these are the ones that really are necessary for us to address if we are to actually achieve collective consciousness, which is absolutely necessary. I can tell you, both at the UN events, the United Nations General Assembly, as well as United Nations Global Compact, and the Athens Democracy Forum that just ended yesterday, everyone was saying that for the first time in human history, we're having a global pandemic. But the way we're addressing the gaps that are emerging are not global. So the response does not meet the needs that have emerged. And so it is at this point that we need to look into the reality of the spaces we're in and address this phenomena as a global community. But that, of course, requires collective consciousness, which we're not that good at yet. So the inequalities that have been accelerated and exaggerated and emerged over the past few months are centered around the issue of race, gender, income, and education. What we've seen happen around the world has been addressed in different ways by different governments, but we're a long way away from dealing with these deficits. Now, if in fact, according to what global leaders are saying is necessary, which is a global response to COVID, and I think all of us agree with that, because if you're a fair-minded person and you look at the news and the facts and the figures that are emerging, you really need to have a collective response to this phenomenon. But since collective consciousness doesn't exist yet fully, we need to examine our norms, beliefs, and ideas and see how we can adjust them, transform them, advance them in order to move from what I like to call from anxiety to agency. Because what's happened with COVID is that we've all become a bit frantic about what's going on. We all experienced right at the beginning, not all, but most of the parts of the world experienced the shortage of toilet rolls, or what we call in North America toilet paper. So that was a clear sign of anxiety on the part of individuals with no rhyme or reason. It was fully born out of fear-based beliefs, not fact-based, because production companies kept announcing through the news that we have enough, don't panic. And it had really nothing to do with the impact of COVID on our health, yet people were going all over the world fighting and trying to overshop this particular item. So that was a clear sign of anxiety. Now, if we're going to gradually, and I think we all know we're having a second wave, many countries have faced a second lockdown or are going through it. This is something that's going to impact us in a number of different ways. But if we are going to really bank on this process to transform our anxiety to agency, and by agency, I mean ability to change our own dynamics, to be the agents of our own change, we need to examine our norms, beliefs, and ideas. There are different ways of doing this. What I've learned over the past few weeks that I've been in these different spaces and hearing what world thinkers and leaders are saying is that one of the norms that needs to change is that we have to learn to restructure power. And one way to do that is to realize that we need to share smaller units of power to enable transition to a healthy, not normal life. What I mean by that is what we see with these massive powerhouses, be they, tech companies, be they production companies like, Nestle, be they educational entities, be they sources of information, they hold massive chunks of power that in a distorted proportion affect people's lives. And what's happening is that because people don't feel heard, many of them are turning to apathy. Many of us say, oh, what's the point of me, voting? What's the point of me doing anything? Decisions are made for us. Who am I to say anything? And we become passive recipients of massive doses of power that keep shifting our lives, seismic shifts in a direction that has nothing to do with a healthy lifestyle. And so what we're realizing is that universal participation is becoming absolutely integral to our survival as a race. And that means universal participation means sharing smaller units of power so that we can transition in a healthy manner. Second, as I mentioned earlier with the example of the toilet rolls, really need to examine our beliefs and change them based on facts, not fear. What we're experiencing, again, is that universality of accounts, so powerlessness. People are feeling, again, a sense of apathy. Whatever they're told, they go with it. We're, hearing these accounts about, for example, how Google and Facebook feed you whatever information you're searching. They're trying to limit your access to diverse viewpoints by just giving you what you seek, by matching what you've sought in the past, not what you're capable of seeking in the future. So we really need to take hold of the process through which we investigate information. Critical thinking is becoming one of the most important soft skills of the new millennium, as well as consultation with diverse voices. So going after facts, becoming fact-based instead of fear-based is one of the things that we really need to pay attention to when it comes to our beliefs. And then ideas, we need to really become transformational and transitional in our thinking. We need to understand that our ideas need to become genuine. How do we do that? We need to restore vision. We need to focus on virtue, whether it's in our private life or public virtues. And we need to adopt values that emancipate us from old ways of thinking. We need new heroes. We need new archetypes. We need new ways of living. We need to examine and pioneer new ways of raising children, of educating ourselves, of earning a living. These are absolutely essential. And now is the time for innovative thinking. Just as we face following the Great Depression, now is the time for us to find new ways of moving forward. So we're in an age of transition. The three major power holders in society are governments, non-governmental organizations, and businesses. They're transitioning all of them. We keep, in my space in human rights, we keep hearing the phrase transitional justice, but this applies everywhere. And in particular, we're coming to realize that really the most powerful sector out of the three that is able to see this transition through are the businesses, because research after research is showing that the younger generation of workers no longer have the ties that the older generation had in the past. In the older generations, we see marital ties. People got married. People were joining different clubs. People joined churches, believed in religion. But today we see that actually the younger generation don't commit to those institutions. The only institution that they really are a part of is a place of work. So businesses have a huge deal of power in shifting and accelerating this transition from the world that we are in right now, the normal life, to what we are hoping to go for, which is a healthy life. So this process of transformation is hallmarked by seeking equality, because we're seeing around the world that exclusion of individuals, whether it's based on sex, income, education, race, leads to rebellion. I think the United States has been the quintessential example in this space, because we've seen the race issue and the demonstrations against racial inequality take over American media. What is very important in this process of transformation for us to understand, and I'd like you to remember this point, because when we come towards the end and look at certain offerings of the Baha'i community, this is a key demographic to think about. There's a sentence here on the screen, 50% of the global population. I don't think everyone can talk, everyone's been muted. I had intended to ask this as a question, but I think I have to answer the question myself. 50% of the global population are below the age of 35. That means whatever solutions we want to come up with have to involve the younger generation. In fact, have to be owned by the younger generation. So in this transformational process, there are certain things that need to happen. Since the start of this year, since January 1st, 2020, 4 individuals have the highest level of wealth in the world. So that's 4 individuals versus 7 billion of us. So there are small islands of wealth in oceans of emerging poverty. Another space that is going to face transformation is that the strong need to embrace the weak. I have put men versus women, but study after study is backing a Baha'i teaching that in fact women are the stronger gender. But at the moment in our world, it's men who hold majority of power and rule majority of spaces. And therefore, exactly as the Baha'i writings have proclaimed, and the international community came to embrace in 1993 at the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, men and boys must take ownership of establishing equality. Another element that's absolutely essential for the process of transformation we must go through because of COVID accelerating the gaps that exist in our collective consciousness is the issue of courageous leadership. We're seeing around the world in certain countries with election processes, in certain businesses, in Hollywood, in Bollywood, so in the world of media, we're seeing that leadership is transforming. Its definition and its implications are changing. And so what we're seeing in general, the particulars differ from case to case, but in general, we're seeing a transition and a transformation from formal structures of leadership to those that are moral leaders. So they may not necessarily have reins of power, as were the case with Martin Luther King or Gandhi, but they emerge far stronger and far more sustainable and lasting than formal forms of leadership. And then what we have to realize is that for us, value-based everyday choices, so how I shop for food, how often I wash my clothes, what kind of clothing I buy, what kind of car I drive, what education I choose for my children, who I choose to marry, where I choose to live, how I recycle my waste, all of this. These choices are very important because they may seem at the micro level, but they change policy at the macro level, which is, again, very, very important in shifting towards collective consciousness. And as one of the speakers at the UN Global Compact said, he said, it's not about what we give back to society anymore. It's about what we are willing to give up, what we're willing to change forever in our lives that will make all the difference in how we transition to a post-COVID healthy life. What is very important in this process of transitioning and transformation is that we need training. We know that automation is changing the whole face of human life. We know that COVID and the rise in unemployment, the rise in poverty is shifting us towards the need for training. So what, again, the Baha'i community has been engaged in, based on the teachings of Baha'u'llah from the 1800s, the Baha'i community has been engaged in a process since 1996. So a very long time, more than a quarter of a century. But now, during these sessions that I mentioned, the UN Global Compact and Athens Democracy Forum and parts of the UN General Assembly, some spoke about this, is the need for training. Well, their definition of training was very much focused on the first 2 aspects that you see on the screen: technical expertise. In other words, let's say people have lost their jobs because of COVID. Now, because of automation, because of the fact that technology has grown massively over the past few months, They may no longer have a job to come back to. So they need to be retrained to assume new positions. Craftsmanship is one of the things that's really emerging. So training seems to be very much focused on those things. Two areas of training that are not yet so popular and people are not paying much attention to, but they're hugely important for accessing rights, are human relationships, how we relate to each other, because our institutions are falling apart. The institution of marriage, the institution of government, the institution of the clergy, the institution of entertainment, all of these are falling apart. And so we need to reattach to each other, re-relate to each other in ways that are sustainable and lasting. And that depends a great deal on how we develop our own characters, pivoting around the issue of collective consciousness. Now, we talk about transformation and training. Here is a wonderful quote from the Baha'i writings that says what the Baha'i faith, and in fact all religions, are about. Baha'u'llah says, is not the object of every revelation to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind, a transformation that shall manifest itself both outwardly, so in the way we live our lives, the way we're seen by others, and inwardly, the way we think, our private life, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. We know from quantum physics that matter is based on human mind. This is something that is now becoming an acceptable fact in science. So the way we think, our inner life, our inward life, affects the environment we live in. So what are we going to transform towards? Let's say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in religion, I don't want any of it. Great. You still live on this planet, you're still going through COVID, you're still affected by everything that's happening around us. So how do we pivot this issue of collective consciousness that seems to be so necessary to a collective or global response to the many dimensions that COVID is highlighting? It's to pivot our collective consciousness or redirect or focus our collective consciousness on the oneness of humankind. It was in the beginning of the session that COVID is affecting the rich and the poor. It's absolutely true. We right now have at least one head of the state that we know of who's impacted by it, who's one of the richest men in the United States. We have also poor people who are dying in other parts of the world. COVID impacts everyone. It doesn't care what your income level is or where you live. It gets to everyone. So it's showing that it doesn't matter where you are from, what color your skin is, what your gender is, what your income or educational bracket is. You can be affected by one common element. You have to remember that with the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, and all the regional wars and genocides we have experienced, it's always been us against them. It's been one population against the other. This is the first time in human history that we, as a planet, are standing against a tiny little microbe or a virus. So it's the first time we're standing shoulder to shoulder. And that's why, in the beginning, I proposed that I advanced the notion that, yes, we went through the previous pandemics, including the Spanish flu, the Spanish pandemic that took place in the beginning of the last century. But this is the first time in human history that the entire planet, because of the shifts in transportation and communication, that we really are all affected by this. And so this is our moment to move our consciousness towards oneness of humankind. Now, how does this then impact our social norms, beliefs, and ideas? Well, it can impact in different ways. But from a Baha'i perspective, if we want to examine this, or even from a social perspective, what we're hearing from leaders of the world at this point in time is that we need to engage in a training process. We need to engage in a transformational, transitional process that's universal. In other words, involves everyone from diverse backgrounds, that it empowers everyone. Empowerment is enabling individuals to access what they need independently. This process needs to really place service, servant leadership. You may have heard this expression. Service is becoming the new watchword in every space you're in, whether it's about a product or a service, business, sort of the private or the public sector. Service is really emerging as an important aspect of our life today. Whatever process of thinking, of training we engage with has to promote critical thinking, because we're being bombarded by information that is very difficult to decipher because of the way technology and big data is impacting us. So critical thinking is a skill that is tantamount to our survival as a human being. Whatever process of training or, again, transition we go through has to focus on neighborhoods. Remember the quote that I shared from Eleanor Roosevelt. It's in these immediate spaces of our neighborhoods, our homes, our offices, our schools, our families, our diverse communities around us that we need to move together, transition together. Again, remember the statistic that I shared earlier, that 50% of the planet are below the age of 35. So whatever training we go through has to focus on youth and children, because this is about generational justice. This is about enabling them to benefit from the world that we're leaving them. Again, another aspect that's very important is that our training needs to enable us to have collaboration at the local level. We need to be able to share resources, because money is going through transformation, inflation, unemployment, the stock market, everything is being affected in ways that are not necessarily pleasant. So we have to learn to share resources other than money in ways that we're able to meet our needs. The system of training that we need in our world today, more and more scholars and educators are saying, needs to be organic and it needs to be systematic. So these are the ways through which training can take place, so that our social norms, beliefs, and ideas can adjust to the collective consciousness that we require in order to transition through this process of the pandemic. So in the Baha'i community, we've been thinking about those ideas for a very long time. And so since 1996, as I mentioned earlier, we've been involved in a process of creating spaces where people can come together and address their immediate needs. Now, COVID and the challenges that that we've been faced with included. I remember many years ago, when Hurricane Katrina affected New Orleans in particular, I had a number of friends that we couldn't be in touch with anymore. And suddenly I received a message from them, and they said they were Baha'is living in a very, very deprived neighborhood. And if you remember, following Katrina, there was a great deal of looting that took place. People attacked different shopping malls, started to steal whatever they could, and there was a great deal of violence. So these friends of mine were stuck on the roof of their building in this very economically deprived neighborhood. So this was in the beginning of the process that the Baha'i community has been involved with. And what they did was they followed exactly what you see in front of you. What they had learned in the Baha'i community was that we need to get together, pray, meditate, reflect, play music, do whatever gives us inner peace in order to be able to reflect and think critically and creatively. we also need to look after our children. So we may be in situations, just like we were with COVID around the world, that we don't have access to schools. Now, these friends of mine were stuck, as I said, on the roof with the hurricane and the situation around them. So what they did was they took all the children that were stuck up there, put them in a corner with some youth, and said, let's have a children's class. Let's learn something together. We also have to empower our junior youth, or our, the youth who are teens. We usually call them teens. So again, these friends were able to take some of these junior youth and got them together to work together around the concept of service to be able to improve their conditions. And it was very interesting because the junior youth that were there together, they came up with the idea of tying their t-shirts together to make a long sort of rope replacement. And then they used that to help someone to go down from the roof through one of the windows that was open to bring food back up for everyone who was left hungry on the roof. So unlike other people who were on the roofs, stranded, in desperate need of water and food, this particular group were able to meet their needs. Why? Because they shared their resources in a creative way and were able to meet their needs. And also the adults who were there immediately began to sit together and consult and study how they could clean their block of apartments after the hurricane was gone, and how they could improve their conditions, who needed what, who had what resources. And so these were the tools through which this particular group of people were able to use in a very concrete, socioeconomically beneficial manner to improve their conditions. So these are some of the tools that the Baha'i community, devotional spaces, children's education, junior youth groups, and adult study circles, these are the tools that the Baha'i community have been engaged with to train ourselves to transition from the system that we live in right now to one that is based and functional with collective consciousness. We're also using these spaces to inwardly change ourselves, to change the way we think, to change the way we express our thoughts, and to change the way in which we employ our words, our thoughts in action. And that process of transformation is something that we've been engaged in, as I mentioned, from 1996 onward. And they're open to everyone. It is not something that's limited to the Baha'i community. It is simply a tool to draw on the vision of oneness of humanity by developing new social norms, beliefs, and ideas that form our collective consciousness in order to be able to become resilient, to become creative, and to move beyond COVID and any other challenges that may emerge between now and the end of the pandemic. So I hope that these few words were of interest to you.